Welcome to the podcast series Real Talk. Real Talk is a discussion-based series that engages with real people, that's you, about real issues that are prevalent in our world. These real issues are causing believers in Yeshua to stop and reflect and consider how are we going to tackle them as we seek to embrace and love and challenge behavioral stances of people who encounter a real God. They will challenge us and our stance as believers in Yeshua as to where we are on the spectrum of love and mercy and justice as we seek to engage the people of our world. So, before we move into our current topics for this evening, let me just invite our panel this week to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Micah and I'm from Nottingham.
I'm Masha and I'm from Nottingham.
I'm Isaac and I'm from Blythe, Northumberland.
I'm Sharon and I'm from Nottingham.
I'm Jasmine and I'm from Nottingham.
I'm Lily and I'm not from Nottingham. I'm from Hertfordshire.
So welcome, panel. Thank you very much for taking the time to be a part of this series. So today, actually, we are ending our series and really on quite a hot topic, which has currently been highlighted in the media and magnified by the media over this last 18 months. You've got footballers all speaking out against it. You've got Lewis Hamilton in Formula One and many, many others really speaking out against this. And I think it's actually fitting for us to shed a little light on this from a Christian or a believer's standpoint. And that subject is racism. Maybe I could ask the question to start with. What are the real issues that we are facing around racism? Just because we are of the faith, because we believe in Yahweh, in Yeshua, does that mean we're exempt from the hype or the emotional connections that we have with regards to this subject? Many of us on this panel and even in our congregations have ancestors and families and immediate family that have been through such a lot of this. So where are we? What are the real issues that surround us as believers in Yeshua? As a first question, and then maybe the second question to think about as we start our conversation is, what should we do as believers in Yeshua? This whole big highlighted, magnified media presence centers around George Floyd. 18 months ago, policeman kneels on his neck and his back and he basically died. We know the story, it's been in the media many times. Of course, the saying is, I can't breathe. And of course, that has generated a rally cry that comes out of protests by many, many, many people across the world, believers, non-believers, white and black, children, adults, everybody has had a voice in this. And we don't hear much of a Christian voice in this. So let's just try to explore this.
I think from a church point of view, you know, on this matter, I mean, it's, as believers, we are clear that Yahweh is a God for all people. So it doesn't matter whether you're Jew, Gentile, whether you're black or white, or whether you're slave or free, Yahweh considers you the same. And I think the challenge that remains for most people is to treat one another as we ourselves would like to be treated. I think with the Black Lives Matters movement, I mean that has generated an enormous response globally, but I think also that is built upon the racism that we're facing nowadays. It's more prevalent in our society, and I think as a white person that has a lot of let me say Black friends, you know, sometimes it's hard to distinguish the right conversation that before this issue had arisen, establishing what now is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Because I think sometimes racism can be quite subtle, and maybe I could say something to one of my Christian brothers or sisters, for instance, say, "Oh, you're so Black," and I will mean nothing by that. But nowadays, I have to be careful because although I don't mean offence, it could be taken as offence. So I think it's important as believers that we carry the message that Yahweh came to bring, that Yeshua came to bring, that everybody is the same, no matter what color, you know, and we need to be that, you know, with each other, the same with each other, no matter, you know, what our color, ethnicity, background.
Appreciate that very much, Isaac. Anybody want to respond to that? Yes, you are absolutely right. There is a sensitivity around how we behave in church because of the media presence, because what that has evoked in us as individuals. Yes, respond, somebody, take that up.
I totally understand what Isaac's saying. I think for me, I think the issues are probably like communication. And by communication, I mean the understanding between those who feel they're suffering racism and those who aren't quite sure what it is. So I believe there has to be like conversations have to be had to discuss these things openly. I feel like there needs to be like communication between those who feel like they're suffering racism and those that aren't, and to have open conversations about certain things and certain topics so that people are free to express themselves. Because I know the kind of thing Isaac would say, and I would even take it as racism, because I know within the congregation of Yahweh, a lot of white people and Black people have grown up together as family. So there's a whole different vibe, there's a whole different understanding. There's been around the culture, there's been immersed in each other's culture, and it's been in an exchange. And I think from there, the understanding does get built. It's not like one person's got power over the other, like there's just like a complete minority. So I think a lot of the times where misunderstanding happens is where you might have one Black person at work, and then everyone says little stuff like, "Oh yeah, when it's summertime, oh no, it's dark as you, no, it's dark as you," and they're thinking, "Well, why are you saying that to me? Like, what, because I'm the only Black person here?" But if it was a case where it's like 50-50, like 50% Black people, 50% white people, and they all kind of like hung out of each other, they could drop these jokes because they had this understanding, they had these difficult conversations. They knew they had rice, peas, and chicken, they had chips and fish and stuff, and they talked about really tough things like slavery and using the N-word. When is it appropriate, is it not appropriate, why you can't say colored, how racism isn't just about calling someone a name, how it is very much part of the institutions, and sometimes it might be subconscious where people don't realize they're doing it. There's probably a difference between prejudice and racism. Prejudice would be just having a preconceived idea, but racism to me would be having a preconceived idea, hearing evidence to the contrary, but still persisting with that idea, even if it's a negative one to me. So I think it's like communication and understanding. And there's a lot of fear, I suppose. I think if it wasn't for George Floyd, these conversations wouldn't be happening. And so people shouldn't be afraid to talk about these things. And I know a lot of white people in England kind of feel this thing like, can I say that? Can't I say that? Can I talk about this? Because they may not be around Black people a lot. They may not feel like they're connected to that community. And so what it does create then is it highlights the division, it enhances the division. between the two groups, because they're not having these conversations. It's just people on the opposite side of two walls. And then, so from this, I've seen a backlash from these protests and stuff. I've seen a backlash where there are people who don't quite understand and probably are prejudiced, and then it's gone negative, and now they're probably being more racist than they were before, and they feel like they're not allowed to have their say. So it can be quite difficult, and it can be quite traumatic, because I feel I've suffered racism all my life. Didn't realize how bad it was until last year. I was at this protest. I was like, wow, I really have like gone through it. Like, and that probably is a source of the anxiety I have. But then to not be believed, it makes it even worse. But when I felt like I was being listened to, like it alleviated that pressure. So I just guess someone who doesn't understand, just ask the questions, and then the people who have been through it, just explain, and don't feel any way. Just let the people explain, and it would help alleviate that and help build understanding between the two sides. I know I chatted for ages, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I think though, if you don't mind me saying, in you know, where racism is concerned, I think the media has hyped a lot of stuff up, you know, in the media that's caused people to think a certain way. And racism has been around, you know, long before what happened with George Floyd. And I think racism is not just about black and white.
No.
It's also about stereotyped views on even of people on the same colour, you know, who come from a certain island, or who come from a certain part of the country, or they come, just say for example, the English and the Irish.
Yeah.
You know, there has always been a stereotypical view, you know, upon the Irish. For people on the outside looking in, they would consider that as racist.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not just, you know, a black and white thing. You know, it's nationality.
Yeah.
You know, can be, people can have racist views as well.
It's true, you know. It's funny you should say that, Isaac, because last year I was talking to a pupil at the school I was at, and his family's Irish, and we were saying how bad it was in the 70s and 60s and stuff. And it was on about how certain pubs were saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and the Irish will be at the last, and people won't be allowed in those places. And I think that's a lot of reason why Irish and black people got on back in the day, because they both suffered. There's that commonality. That's what builds understanding between those groups. I know in Meadows there's a lot of like Irish people and black people who kind of got together and had kids because of those same sorts of things. So, so true, Isaac.
I think coming from an Irish background myself, but I also think it was easier for the Irish community, a generation on, to integrate into the British society. Not so noticeable, unless you might ask them that they've got a name like Patrick O'Flanagan or something like that. But we tended to integrate and fit in more. Is that the right thing to say? I'm not sure.
Yes.
For me, I think personally, you know, having lived how many years of my life, I think what it is, racism is fear. It's built on fear, because we fear what you know, other people that we perhaps don't know enough about. You know, we fear things that we're not sure about, that's not the same as us. One of the things that that surprised me recently is that there was a series on the TV, and it was really saying how it talked about how what happened when the people from the West Indies were invited to come to England to work, and they were invited to come to what is to them was the mother country, because if you we know that the West Indies was colonialized by the British, and so it was like coming to, you know, they would say we're going to the mother country, to find that actually the mother country didn't mind them coming to work, but they minded them, you know, mixing with their white counterparts simply because it was a mix of color, and that was the fear that, you know, you're black, we're white, and the mix wouldn't be great, you know, fear. Obviously now people have more knowledge, people, you know, understand that it's not going to cause any kind of physical problems or anything like that. But it was partly to do with that. It's partly to do, they embraced the people from Europe, they embraced the Irish, they really did, because they were as white as they were, mostly. And so it wasn't a problem, but it was because of the colour. And that is where racism really, in a lot of ways, that's the crux of it. That's where it sits, in that space where you're a different colour. So because of that, you're different. You can't be the same as I am. And I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about back then, in the early 60s when people were coming. And it caused a lot of problems. Today I was at my parents' home, and my mum was talking to a guy, came to look at the bathroom, and she was talking to him, and she was telling him what it was like for her when she first came in the 60s. And people were afraid, she was a carer, and people were afraid to touch her, or for her to touch them, because, you know, she was going to contaminate them. Or so it was a real issue, and a lot of it was to do with colour, which is unfortunate. Obviously, as I said, you know, knowledge and understanding has evaporated a lot of those issues, and things that people used to get really worried about is gone. But, you know, I don't know about anybody else, but I have lived with the fact that I am conscious that I am different, because people often made me feel that way. And only because of my colour, not for any other reason. So it is real. And I think for me, it is when you try to have a conversation with someone and they will immediately say, I'm not racist. And it's not like you're saying to them, you're racist. You're just trying to share your story. You're just trying to share, this is how it was, you know, or this is how it is. And then, so then they don't hear your story, and they don't hear what you're saying to them, because they're worried that you're thinking they're racist. And it's the furthest thing from my mind, really. And I think that if we would go back to what Michael said, it's about communication. So first we need to hear each other, because yes, I completely agree that Yahweh looks at us as people, his people. He doesn't look at us based on our color or what we look like, but he looks at us the same, in the sense of we are his children. We are all Yahweh's children. That's a fact. But we all come from different places. We all have different experiences. Our lives have been different for lots of different reasons. And sometimes it's just so important to hear that. And one of the difficult things really is that we were asked to come into the country. We stayed in the country. We went to school in the country. The curriculum says very little about colonialism, very little about how we got to where we were. So we still remain the very weird people from another country with a different color. So it's not taught. There's the history of how we came to be where we are right now in our world is not often taught in school. It's not part of the school curriculum. So it still makes that divide. It still makes that divide, because your history isn't talked about. You know, where you're coming from isn't talked about. And I think, personally, I think that's where it needs to begin to change. You know, we've come a long way in this country. I am not going to debate the fact, people say this country is not in no way racist. I'm not going to have a debate about that because I don't think that's necessarily important. But I do think that it needs to start from the very youngest age in the curriculum, that we're all this, okay, we're all the same people, we were created by, and then that's another problem because they don't even believe that, so it's a hard thing. But the curriculum, it needs to have a truer history. The history needs to be a lot more real and relevant to the people who live in this country.
Education, education, education. I think that has to be our number one priority. We're talking globally and maybe outside of the church. I really want to bring this back to inside of the church now. I think most of us are aware of the things that I think Isaac and Sharon and Micah and Asha have already shared. Let's focus in a little bit on the congregation. Micah suggested that because we've grown together, there is a level of understanding and etc. etc. And in one part, I totally agree with that. But what this situation of the George Floyd has evoked in us is bigger and broader, and we've found that the few people that have dared to voice some issues around this, there has been some mixed emotions. I want to talk about that. I mean, Sharon really has identified one of the key issues. She suggested it's fear, right? And and is that perfect love casts out fear, the scripture tells us, doesn't it, right? So in the environment, dare I say this, a safe environment of the church, how are we perceived? How is this meted out? Who dictates what's right and wrong in these sort of matters with regards to, I'm using George Floyd because I think that's what's triggered all of this. I don't want to focus on him being a black man and stuff. I'm just talking about a general issue of justice and injustice with regards to this. He's been brought to justice. He's now been sentenced and whatever else. And whether we agree with that or not, that's not what we really want to debate today or even discuss. But I do want to discuss it from a point of view of being in the church. Now on this panel, we've got a variety of people, all of which I certainly don't have any issues. I could say stuff I'm safe, I'm comfortable with you guys, but I know there are others in our fellowship that wouldn't be as comfortable, wouldn't be as safe to talk about and feel that you could share as openly as I'm hoping we're going to do in a little while. Anybody come up against difficulties within the church around this issue?
So I grew up in the church, and
okay, can you just for the sake of the audience, please just explain a little bit about growing up in the church.
So we lived communally in some house, we had several houses, and people from all races, nationalities lived together in this home.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
So I grew up in that from the age of 3. And I would say I know one of the problems with this is to do with fear, but I also think it's to do with ignorance, because people would just say things without actually thinking about it and thinking how it would impact on an individual. So for instance, I was called Chokpud Jazz. So that affected me because I was a child growing up. I was fat. And so I was nicknamed Chokpud Jazz, but that impacted my life because it made me feel as I wasn't good enough and I was just stupid, because a chopped pud, yeah, a pudding to me is silly. So it impacted me, and I couldn't say, because these were adults who thought it was funny. So it's ignorance in not thinking about actually how it would impact somebody's life. And also thinking, well, would you say to a fat white girl, white pudding? I don't think they would, because it wouldn't enter. I think a lot of the time people say your colour because it has more of an impact. And I do think it's about education. I have since been able to express my upset and how it affected me. So I am no longer affected by that, but I do think it's ignorance. Also, since the George Floyd thing, I have spoken to some of my friends in church, and I have been amazed at how still ignorance prevails. And I have chosen not to get in an argument about it. And I think it's about just, as Sharon was saying, hear what I'm saying. You know, if your house was on fire, I would put water on your house to put it out. I wouldn't put the water on my house, which is standing there bone dry. I would put the water out. And at the moment, when this was all going on, it was focused on the race, because that's what came out. But this, having conversations and people just saying, well, you're causing racism and segregation because you're saying, let's focus on Black people. So it can get very heated, and I still think that's ignorance, because you haven't sat down to think about how it's impacting Black people's lives. And I think as church members, we should be more willing to hear what each other are saying and consider that. And yeah, it might not be what I necessarily think, but I must appreciate where you're coming from. And I think that doesn't often happen. And that's what we need to do, really, is appreciate where people are coming from. Even if I don't necessarily agree with you, I've heard you and acknowledge that that's how you feel, because that's what Yeshua did. He empathized with people. He didn't say, oh, no, it doesn't go like that. So we have to have empathy. We have to have understanding and compassion. And I think that's where we need to be as a church, acknowledging, this is how that person feels, and take that on board.
Thank you, Jasmine. Go on, Isaac, if you want to respond.
I think with regards what happened with the Black Lives, something that I quickly identified with in the church was that how a lot of people initially dealt with that, especially white people, was they said, I don't have a problem with Black people, but that wasn't the issue. That wasn't the issue that I quickly identified that was facing a lot of our Black members. And I think you're right, Jasmine, that there is lack of understanding, lack of empathy even, because what I quickly realized was that from the people I spoke with was that there was systemic racist abuse in our brothers and sisters past. So that was the bigger issue. It wasn't the fact that I, as a white person, hadn't had a problem or don't have a problem with Black people, but it was how our Black members were feeling in the wake of what was happening, and how that aroused some real deep emotions that were brought to the surface because of it. And I think you're right. It's that the church needs to identify with, to see that the church comes together to support each other equally with our brethren that are suffering because, you know, of what happened, you know, with George Floyd.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Lily.
I was going to say, just building on that, I think we just seem to lose track of the point that the church is not meant to be a shining paragon and a perfect example. The church is a place for sick people. Church is a place for broken people. Church is a place for people that are going through pain and have felt pain, and they're looking for some acceptance. And yes, they're looking for someone to listen. And I think we've just gone away from that. It's not about the fancy lights and the wonderful music and the powerful sermons. It's about loving one another. And that's what I think is missing. I think generationally, I would say our church is probably on the older side of things, and generationally it was harder to open up about your emotions, and we're seeing that much more, I guess, sort of with the younger generation. It's becoming easier, or it's becoming more common to talk about how you feel, or to go to therapy, or to you post your thoughts or whatever on Twitter. And I don't necessarily think that the church has a space for that to just harness people's experiences and what they're going through, because I think what's the easiest thing to do is sweep it under the carpet and say it might be happening in the world, but it's not happening in my world. And that's because if it's not impacting you, you just tend to think that it's not a problem. And yeah, I think that's my point, is just because we're a church doesn't mean that we have to fix it, but it equally doesn't mean that we ignore it and wait for the world to fix itself.
Well said.
Well said.
Indeed, yeah.
Well said.
And I think that, you know, the heart of the matter is, you're absolutely right. Yeshua came for everyone, and if we're hurting and if we're broken, if we're bruised, there has to be this place where we come together and consolidate together in this. Stand shoulder together, shoulder to shoulder with me, and feel my pain. Allow me to cry. Allow me to talk. Allow me to just vent my frustrations. Let the love of Yeshua prevail in this. Don't brush me aside. Don't think it's not happening to me. Hear and respect what I'm saying. Very, very, very important. Rose, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Lily is saying, just listening and thinking about what has been happening, and as a church, the role that we should be playing. We do probably have members who are like Sharon was saying, or was it somebody was saying, you know, Isaac was saying, it's generational. So there are times when people do and say things not knowing that it will cause an offense, and oftentimes offense has occurred, and because there wasn't the platform that Lily has spoken about that is promoted or that is there so that you can say how you're feeling without getting something else heaped on top of it and make it even worse. So it's important that going forward we have a platform, we have somewhere that people can come and say how I'm feeling about a particular thing without being judged, or without the fear of being judged or being thrown in the back seat, for want of a better word. So as a church, it's something that we need to look at, and probably something that we need to promote, to say this is what is happening and this platform is here, or this is here that people can come and say whatever. And if it means apologizing, we do that, because we have to, as it has been pointed out, we're here as the light of the world. We have to make sure that people can look to us and see an example, and see that, you know, that in that church, this is how it is, and we feel that this is the way forward. That's probably what we need to look at as a church going forward.